In this video, I am going to demonstrate the use of for loops and for each loops with an array. I'm going to create an array using a for loop and traverse it using a for and for each loop so you can see how this thing works. So let me start off with my class, my template for loops, and in this thing here, and class for loops. Remember that class names are capitalized. Then my public static void main string args. Remember to put that space in between the parentheses for parentheses spacing. 3. And then here's my main method and method main. Okay. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to create an array of integers or declare it, and then actually fill it up using a for loop, and then print it out using a for and for each loop. So I'm going to create an array of integers. So int brackets that tells the compiler that I'm going to create an array. I'll call it nums, and this is going to be new int. So a new thing of integers, and I'll put 10 make it so they can hold 10 elements. Okay, so that's creating an array. There's nothing in it at the moment, but now I'm going to fill it in. So here's one use of a for loop. For int index, and I'll run through. I'll type it in first, and I'll explain it. 0 index less than nums dot length index plus plus 1 2 3. So what this line in the for loop does is it's actually three parts. It's a variable declaration. So I'm going to create an integer called index, which is the index for each element in the array, like each slot in an egg carton. Set it equal to 0 first, and as long as that's less than the number of items in the array, which is 10, as long as it's less than that, I'm going to do whatever I put in this line here. This may be 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 lines of code, and I'm going to after that increase the index by 1. So basically the loop occurs right here. It starts here, goes to the contents of the whatever I have written here, goes back, increases by 1, and keeps looping around. This is your loop. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say nums index equals, and I'll say index times 2. So I'm going to put in multiples of 2. So again, initialize the index to 0, and I use the word index because that's what each element in the array is referred to by an index number. I'll say is it less than 10? So 0 less than 10, true. Complete this statement. So take the value of 0, multiply by 2, which is still 0, put it in the 0th element, increase it by 1, and then loop through here. To see if that actually works, let's use another for loop to print it out. For index equals 0 index nums dot length index plus plus, and I'm going to use a system.out.println to, should put an N4 here as well, to print it out. System.println nums index, and let's compile that and see if it works. Compile. Oh, this is int index. Compile. Looks like it works. Close that. Right click it. And if I bring the window over here, it looks good. So I created an array of 10 elements, and I filled it in with multiples of 2. And if I go back to the code here, you see that the second for loop here does that. One question that often comes up is that I have two for loops here, and this is called index, and so is this one. Sometimes you will be inclined to call it index 1 and index 2 because you think that they will conflict with one another. But since it's in a block, basically because this index is being used within a beginning and end curly brace, once this block is over, or once the loop is done and we're out of this curly brace, that variable ceases to exist. So it's pretty much gone, and when I start a new one, the compiler has no idea that it ever existed before. So we're safe in using it again. The for each loop is a kind of a shortcut for loop. So I'll say for and I'll say num and for each. And just for clarity, I'm going to put here system.out.println. Because I'm going to be printing it twice. So the way this is read is as following: for each integer, and I'll call it num. This is like a temporary variable, and I don't use the word index because I'm not actually referring to an index. I'm actually going to pull one number out of the array nums and store it in here temporarily. So I'm not using an index. I'm actually pulling something out of the array. If you want to use the analogy of an egg carton, here I referred to an egg in the egg carton by the slot it was in. Here I'm actually pulling it out temporarily, or making a copy of it actually in this variable, and then just using it directly. You can see here I had to use the bracket notation to actually print out the number in the index. At the index, here I'm actually pulling out a copy of it and then printing it out. So it's a little bit cleaner if you take a look at here for printing things out, and that's the major use of for each loops, is to print out elements in an array. If you start modifying things using a for each loop, you can create some errors, which are called concurrent modification exception errors, which you'll probably see later. But let's compile it and see what happens. Compile, no errors, run it. And so now you can see here's the first time around and the second time around. So that's a quick tutorial on for loops, how to fill up an array using a for loop, print it out, and then also the use of a for each loop to print things out as well.